Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. This is the second of a series of 6 Azure Week webinars. My name is Laura and I am delighted to be joined by Wim, who will present the topic Guardians of your Azure Galaxy, 10 tips to govern your Azure ecosystem. Remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC23. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the Content tab at the top. Continue your learning by joining us for the next webinar of Azure Week, which is a 20-minute mini webinar titled Embrace the Best of Both Worlds with the Power of Azure Hybrid. This webinar takes place tomorrow, Tuesday, July 18th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. from 11 a.m. to 11:20 a.m. CEST. For full details, please check out sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. You can now watch the European Power Platform Conference 2023 showreel video from Dublin last June. Over 1,200 Power Platform enthusiasts gathered in Dublin for the European Power Platform Conference 2023. Check out our amazing showreel video full of highlights from the conference in Dublin last month. Next year, we are taking the European Power Platform Conference to Brussels. Alongside 1,500 of your professional peers, you can expect world-class expert guidance to help you succeed in your projects and career and an unforgettable experience in the beautiful city of Brussels. Register your interest for the European Power Platform Conference 2024 in Brussels at sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference. Europe's premier Microsoft 365 and Azure Technologies Conference takes place this November 27th to 30th in Amsterdam. With access to over 100 world-class speakers, over 120 expert sessions, there is endless knowledge to gain at ESPC23. Microsoft technologies are advancing rapidly, so stay in the know by attending ESPC23 to hear from the greatest on the very latest. Get your early bird discounted tickets for ESPC23 in Amsterdam and join us and learn to better master Microsoft 365 and Azure. Visit sharepointeurope.com to secure your tickets at this discounted price. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you might have into the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will also be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter today, Wim. Hello, Wim.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. And for some people, probably late at night or early in the morning. So thank you for having me, I would say. Let me see if I can share my screen. So my screen should be showing, if it's okay. Let me take my slides. Okay, give me a sec. Okay. So first of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me in this webinar, which is part of ESP's Microsoft Azure Week. Today, I will be sharing some valuable insights on Azure governance, including tips, tricks, and some best practices. Before I dive in, I want to first of all express my gratitude to everybody involved in organizing these live webinars. And additionally, I highly recommend that you also explore the other sessions scheduled for this week, because I think there's quite a lot to learn. So as you can see on today's agenda, I have part of a plan. Firstly, I will provide a short overview of what Azure governance is and how it can help you to keep control over your complete Azure environment. Next, I will dive into 10 tips. And before I close off, I hopefully will have some 5-minute time for some Q&A so that I can answer any of your questions. Before we start, let me also shortly introduce myself. So, like I already said, my name is Wim Matthijssen. I live in Belgium, where I work as an Azure Technical Advisor. I'm also an MCT and a Microsoft Azure MVP. And community-wise, I'm a founding board member of a Belgium user group called MC2MC. And as you can see, I also have my own blog, https://wmatthijssen.com. And like most IT professionals these days, I'm also on Twitter, LinkedIn. So if you ever want to reach out, ask a question related to Azure governance, or even just want to say hi, feel free to contact me through my Twitter handle at @wmatthijssen or LinkedIn, or I think you can even simply scan the QR code at the bottom of the screen on the right. So, all right, now time to kick things off and to jam on some Azure tunes. So let us first of all look into what is governance. If we look at the definition, it still gives it. We can say governance ensures that policies and strategies are actually implemented and that the required processes are correctly followed. Governance includes defining roles and responsibilities, measuring and reporting, and also taking actions to resolve any issues identified. So, okay, nice. That's the definition, and that's the definition ITIL puts on it. But now, yeah, the burning question that emerges is, why should we employ Azure governance within our own Azure environment? Well, by implementing Azure governance, you not only enhance your security, but also ensure regulatory compliance through policy enforcement. You foresee audits and even foresee compliance reports and so on. And furthermore, it also helps with effective cost management and with optimization, while in the same time you establish a consistent process and also consistent standards throughout your complete Azure environment. So it equips you with mechanisms and processes in a way to keep in control over all your applications and workloads running inside of your Azure environment. And you should also know, and probably a lot of people would know it, the cloud doesn't run itself. Although still some people and some companies seem to always think it does, but it's always a shared responsibility. So depending on which type of service in Azure you purchase, is it IaaS, is it PaaS, or even SaaS, just remember that there is always some level of shared responsibility between the provider and the customer. And in the case of Azure, this is of course Microsoft and you as a customer. So depending on which type of workload you're running, you still need to do some things yourself. Just look at the screen. For example, when you're running things on-prem, you still need to do everything. You need to manage your own physical data center. You need to manage the operating system, the application, all the data on it. If you're, for example, running IaaS, Microsoft takes everything under their control until the hypervisor, and everything deployed on top of the hypervisor, your Azure VMs and so on, the data in those Azure VMs, all applications, that's your own responsibility. This, just keep in mind, shared responsibility, quite important to remember. But I think that's quite enough talked about what Azure governance is and what we can do with it. Let us now delve into some tips and some best practices. And let us begin by examining an important aspect of Azure governance, namely the Azure naming convention. So most of us will know that using a well-defined and solid Azure naming convention is quite crucial for several reasons, like the ease of maintenance, because then it can help you to simplify resource management and maintenance, but it also helps you to maintain consistency and uniformity across all your Azure resources, making it simpler to manage and organize them. And it also avoids confusion that can arise from using different naming styles for similar resources. So on the screen right now, you can see an example of a naming convention being used in my own environment or when I deploy environments at customer environments. You can see over here that I place my resource abbreviation at the front, followed by the abbreviation of the environment, then a short company abbreviation, then the resource type, and then a number. So 01, 02, 03, and so on and so on. However, a large number of people and customers still find it quite difficult to choose a good resource abbreviation. Luckily, there are some resources that can help you, like the Microsoft Cloud Adaptation Framework, the CAF framework, or the Microsoft Well-Architected Framework, the WAF framework. But another great resource that I use quite a lot is the Azure Naming Convention Periodic Table. It's set up by Justin Connors, and it's quite a helpful resource. So if you ever want to deploy some new resources into your environment and you just don't know how to start naming them, it's a simple website. You can download it even as a PNG or a JPEG file. Just open it, and you can simply look at the short abbreviation of the specific resource you want to deploy. The nice thing is that it also will specify which type of resource it is. So if you build up your resource group implementation based on the types like networking, compute, web, containers, and so on, it's easy to see which type of resource with the abbreviation belongs to which resource group. So everything, one place, one simple page, and you can get started using a good naming convention. Another resource, another handy resource I also want to mention when you start working with or choosing an Azure naming convention is the Azure naming tool, which is a free .NET containerized tool, which you can use to generate a correct name for any of your Azure resources. And this one is also based on best practices, focusing on naming conventions defined in the CAF framework. So you can simply download the generation tool through that specific link, but I think we will share the slides afterwards, so don't look it up. You can also replay this and then look at the link. Second tip, or in this case, or focused on Azure management groups. So many of us will already be familiar with Azure Management Group, which allows us to organize our Azure subscriptions by creating a hierarchical grouping system. When we do so, or when we use them, they will help us not only to control access and management permissions, but also to enforce and centralize the overall management of our resources. If you now take a look at the table on the screen, it probably will look familiar to some of you. So this screen illustrates the management group hierarchy as described also in the CAF framework. You see, I already mentioned quite a lot of CAF framework. If you're ever designing your Azure environment, definitely look at that framework because it will guide you along the way with some best practices also. But as you can see on the screen right now, we have the tenant root group, we have the top level company management root group. You can see there is a platform management group, we have a landing zones management group, the decommissioned ones and the sandbox ones, and we see that all those specific subscriptions are placed underneath that one. If we then apply it in praxis, we get something similar like this. This is the one I'm currently using in my own demo environment. Once again, tenant root group, I renamed it. I will show directly how you can do it. You can see my top company level management root group called my company name. You can see I have the decommissioned one. I use the company short abbreviation in between, and I use the resource abbreviation MG. Same thing, landing zones are there. Underneath the landing zones, I even have specific ones, like the one used for Azure Arc. So I have a specific management group underneath my landing zones management group For example, describe one used for ARC-related resources, the one for my AVD subscriptions. Some customers have specific ones for their SAP subscriptions, and so on and so on. So the screen showing now is bringing into practice the management group hierarchy described in the CAF framework. But the things I want to mention, you could see that I renamed my tenant root group, but I also want to specify the thing we see quite a lot still at customers' environments is that the ID being used is still the same one as the display name, but in the end, this can end up giving you problems. As you can see, the one described in the tenant root group is always an ID. You can't choose that one. It's there by default. Whenever you create a new tenant, it will be like that. And that specific ID of your tenant root group management group is exactly the same as the one describing your tenant ID. So if you open Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Entra these days, you will see that the ID, the GUID, Global Unique Identifier, is exactly the same as the one of your tenant root group. And that's why, for example, if you want to apply Azure policies at your top level management group, your root tenant group, it won't fit. If you're using a display name or whatever, it won't work. So that's why in the end, if you're creating your management groups, you can do it through PowerShell, you can do it through Biceps, ARM, whatever. Always try to create a specific the GUID like it's used on a tenant root group. And for example, with PowerShell, you can simply use the new GUID and it will create a specific GUID for you. So if you're using your PowerShell, you're trying your Azure PowerShell script, just use new GUID, let it picked up by the different management groups, and you're good to go. Same thing if you're using Biceps, just use the new GUID with the two brackets, the round brackets at the end, and you're also good to go. That's easy, and then in that way, you have your display name, which will be a human readable name, so you can still open the portal and look on a human readable way through your management groups, but the ID being used for any automating purposes or operational purposes is always a GUID. So that's one tip I want to give you, but before we go into the next topic, let me also show some other things. So you see I'm already logged on to my Azure portal. Let me go to my management groups. They will open. A tip I want to give you, most of us will have the sandbox management group. And by default, when a new subscription is added to this flow, it will be normally, if you don't change it, will be placed under the root tenant group. If you ever want to specify it and use the best practice, which is every new subscription will be placed under the sandbox management group, which doesn't have any policies applied to it, any RBAC rules. So when a new subscription is added, developers can just deploy everything they want. And from the moment everything is deployed, you can move your subscription through the correct management group where all the specific policies and so on are applied. So if you want to change the default one where new subscriptions will end up, just go to management group, select settings, default management for new subscriptions, look at this, GUID, specify the GUID of your sandbox management group, and you're ready to go. Next to that, if you ever want to change the name of your tenant root group so it follows the naming convention you use for your other management groups, you need to be a global admin. Didn't hear that one from me. And when you're logged in as a global admin, just go to Azure Active Directory, scroll down underneath security. No, it's not that one, sorry. Underneath properties, that was the one I need to have. Just go to access managers for Azure resources and just put this slider to yes. And then your user access administrator. And when you have the global admin and user access administrator role, you're normally good to go to change the root tenant group. So if you click on it, you should be able to rename the group and apply it. So if I now save it, I can save it, as you can see, but I will cancel because I don't want to change it at the moment. Let me go back to my slides. Give me a second. Okay, now they should be showing again. So third tip is all about tags and resource logs. Resource tags, like most of us will know, consist of a name and value pair that help you to efficiently organize and categorize your Azure resources. These tags can be applied to various resources, including virtual machines, storage accounts, virtual networks, and so on. And by using tags, you make resource management more streamlined and organized. Some of the more commonly used tags in the environment are those that describe the criticality, the environment, the purpose, and the cost center. But next to that, you can also use specific tags that you can use for all kind of management tasks and operational tasks, like the one you can see on the screen right now describing the backup schedule. That backup schedule, in the value, the policy being used in Azure Backup is specified, so you can also read it. It's a policy for a VM. It runs at 11 p.m. It has 2 instant recovery points, and it runs for the monthly, weekly, monthly, and so on the 3rd Sunday for 27 days. It will keep your backup for 4 to 5 weeks, and so on and so on. So by combining a tag, you can also make your operational tasks like backups. At the bottom, you see also the update management. Same thing, update schedule, specifying the update task used through Azure Automation Update Management. That's already 2 ways you can use tags in an operational way. But another one, for example, is I see quite a lot of customers, whether developers or somebody else, deploy new resources in their environment. It's for a specific project, and that project runs for 3 months. And after 3 months, those resources aren't not needed anymore, so they can be cleaned up. The only thing is, if you look at that environment half a year later, quite a lot of those resources will be still there because nobody cleaned it up. If you, for example, now specify an end date when you deploy that specific resource group with all those resources, and then you create something, an Azure function, for example, or a logic app or an Azure Automation runbook that from time to time looks at all those tags specifying an end date, and if the end date is passed, just deletes all those resources. And once again, an easy way to use a tag in combination with an operational task in this time for cleaning up your resources. Another one I also find quite an important tag is the one that describes the resource owner. As you can see, it's a physical email address or whatever from somebody working in an environment who normally asks for that specific resource to be built, or who's responsible for that specific project where that specific resources are belonging to. Because quite a lot I need to do assessment at customer environments, and in the end, if you ask who's responsible for that specific resource of who is deployed, it's always, I don't know, somebody before me that did it, and so on and so on. And with specifying the resource owner, you will definitely quickly find who's responsible for it or who had to be responsible for it. So once again, 2 extra tags you can use for any of your operational tasks. The one describing the update managed, by the way. So if I go to my virtual machines, you can see I have some. If I, for example, click on my domain controller, you can see that specific update schedule is there. If I now, for example, go to Azure Automation, the nice thing is you can also automate that the Azure Monitor agent and or the Log Analytics agent, if you're using still that one, is automatically deployed. Because it's automatically deployed, you can go to Azure Automation. So let me go to my automation account. You can see I have one in place. If I click, for example, on that one and click on Update Management, you can see I have some machines already on board. I have quite a lot of VMs missing some updates, but if I look into the deployment schedules, you can see I have 2 deployment schedules at the moment. It's exactly the value described in that tag. So for the domain controller, this one. And the thing I did, for example, there is a group selected based, you can see, for example, and it's based on that specific tag. So every VM in my environment who has onboarded into Azure Monitor and is connected to my Log Analytics workspace and which has that specific tag is automatically placed under that update schedule and will be automatically updated during that window. It's easy like that, using a tag in an operational way. Let me go back to my slides and share my screen again. So we went through all of these. Next thing, a tip related to resource logs. As an administrator, you have the option to apply logs to an Azure subscription, resource group, or an individual resource to safeguard them against accidental deletions and modifications. This log, in a way, take precedence over any user permissions. So it doesn't matter if you're able to delete something. If there's a log on there and you don't have those specific rights to remove the log, you can't delete any resource. So you can choose to set logs to prevent either deletions, like I just said, or modifications, depending on your specific needs. But as a best practice, only consider applying a cannot delete log at a resource group level rather than to individual resources. Next to that, personally, I almost rarely use read-only logs. The only resource where I use it, for example, is on a resource specific, so no resource group, is on a virtual network gateway. From the moment the site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute is set up, most of the time you don't need to change anything on that specific resource, and that's the only resource where I would set a read-only log. Next to that, if you decide to apply read-only logs to other resources or to resource groups, be cautious not to use them on resource group that contain storage, backup, or automation resourcing, because doing so could lead to various operational issues, such as backups that no longer function correctly, or you're working with those keys on your storage account, so you can't read those keys anymore, and you can't connect to your storage account, and so on and so on. So definitely read-only logs, look out with storage, backup, or any automation resources. Now, moving on to some Azure policy tips and best practices. So we all know, I think, that Azure Policy is quite an essential server in Azure, allowing you to create, assign, and manage policies. And these policies play a crucial role in enforcing various rules and effects on your resources, ensuring their compliance with corporate standards, and even some of your service level agreements you need to follow. As a best practice, it's always advisable not to apply any policies directly on your tenant root group, the one I renamed. Instead, you can begin by applying policies starting with a top-level company management root group. Like you can see, my top-level company is there, and I only apply policies from that level, so I would never apply them on this one. And after that, you apply them on a top-level company root group, you can start applying different policies on your landing zones and platform, because those are mostly also quite different. Platform is everything that gives you connectivity and foresees your identities and so on. And the landing zones is the management group where you place your AVD subscriptions, your production subscriptions, your ARC subscriptions, SAP subscriptions, and so on. So most of the time, policies applied to those top level ones, the one specifying the landing zones and the one specifying the platform, are also different. Next to that, the sandbox management group is also quite important, like I said in the beginning. So you should normally, best practice is to exclude the sandbox management group from any Azure policies being applied. So the advice here is don't apply anything. Also, don't apply any RBAC rules or whatever on your sandbox management group. As another best practice, you should always use Azure Policy Initiative. Those are more recommended than using single policies, because by combining multiple policies that are closely related, in my opinion, you can achieve a better organization and management than by using individual policy definitions. So, for example, at customer environments, I most of the time specify a default company governance policy initiative with some more general policies in there, like the allowed locations, that storage accounts only should have those specific SKUs and so on. And I place that one on the top level company management group. And then you can have specific initiatives focusing on platform and one focusing on landing zones. And then you can even go lower and select specific ones for ARC-related resources, AVD-related resources, and so on. Next to that, those familiar with on-premise services and Active Directory, I hope will find this screenshot showing at the screen at the moment quite familiar and are quite familiar with the one. For the other ones, we're not familiar with this. You can see that VMI filtering is being used to apply specific group policy objects, GPOs, to a particular type of resource, specifically in the case of this one, this query, Windows Servers 2016 into your environment. So specific GPOs will go through that specific filter, and if it's a Windows Server 2016, that specific GPO will be applied. Okay, that's the wrong way. Until recently, the same process wasn't applicable or usable when you used Azure policies. However, luckily, now we have Azure Policy Resource Selectors, which allow you to filter the resources to which a specific assignment is applied. You can choose the resource types and even make selections based on the resource location, including resources without a specific location. So for the one showing at the screen right now, that specific policies, those policies that will be applied to that specific single policy or even through that policy inside of an initiative, will only pinpoint out and will only work on storage accounts and on virtual machines. So any other resource, so for example, you want to specify specific tags only on your storage accounts and your virtual machines, then you can use the resource selectors, and all other resources that specific tag applied will not apply, but only on those specific resources. So definitely a good way to filter the resources specific assignment is applied to. Definitely look in to that one. Of course, so far we have explored some best practices and tips that you can utilize when applying Azure policies in your environment. However, managing a large number of policies can become quite challenging when trying to maintain a clear overview. And that's where Azure Governance Visualizer, or Azure GovVis, developed by Julian Howard, comes to the rescue. It can help you to simplify the process and gain better understanding of your policies and their impact. But let me quickly show you. So if you run that specific tool and you apply it into your environment, it will create a specific folder, and under that folder, quite a lot of Excel files will be there, but there's also a specific HTML. If you open that HTML, let me enlarge the screen. Oh, it's already on under 50. You will see it pulled out my complete management group structure. So I can look in it from over here. Nice thing is, you can also, it also digs a little bit deeper, specify all the policies applied on specific management groups. You can even look at all the role-based access controls and where they're focused on which management group and so on which encryption and which resource they're applied. So definitely quite a good resource if you ever need to assess a customer's environment, or if you want to look at specific policies being applied and why is this not working or that not working. Free tool to use. Just go to the GitHub page and look at how to set it up, and you get quite an easy overview of everything being applied on which level and so on. Let me go back to my screen slides. Another thing I also want to mention, so next to AskGovBiz, there's another valuable tool, or better said, website you can use, and that's AZ Advertiser. It can help you to keep up with new releases, changes, and updates in any Azure policy definition and initiative, as well as in any Azure RBAC rules definitions in your environment. So also be sure to bookmark this site if you want to work, if you work with a lot of Azure policies and you want to keep up with the latest changes and so on and so on. Simply go to the website, look towards specific policies. You will also find those that are deprecated and so on. For the last policy related tip, I also like to mention the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, or the MCSB. This special policy is available for free and offer specific best practices and recommendations to enhance the security of not only workloads, but also data and services in your Azure or even multi-cloud environment. It is based upon recommendations found in the WAF framework, also from the CISO and other security best practice standards and frameworks. So if you want to apply it, quite easy. Go to Azure Policy, go to Definitions, look for Cloud Security Benchmark, select it, and apply it to your top-level company management group, and it will flow through your complete environment. Nice thing is, it won't change anything in your environment. It will just audit, and it will pinpoint out everything that could be set up better or more secure. So remember, free, apply it, that's it, audit mode, and you can also look into all those security recommendations for completely free. Next tip, let's now move on to Azure Workbooks. So we all know that monitoring is quite an essential aspect of staying informed and in control of your Azure resources and your environment. And for this, Azure Workbooks offer a visual way to create reports in the Azure portal, combining data from various resources. When using workbooks, you can merge text, log queries, metrics, and parameters. But at the moment, there are already quite a vast number of community-created workbooks available, such as the one, for example, that describes the offering resources in your environment. So if you apply that one, it will look at all the disks, all the network interfaces, public IPs, resource group that are not longer being used. So for example, you created a VM, they attached a public IP, they deleted the VM, didn't clean up the public IP, the public IP is still there, it still costs you some money. With this simple workbook, just open it, you can dig into it and look at it. But let me also quickly show it in my Azure environment. So you can simply go to Workbooks, Azure Workbooks. There are quite some community ones. I already deployed quite a lot in my environment. You can see I have the one specifying the orphan resources. But for example, I also have something related to FinOps insights, landing zone checklist. So you build up your landing zone and you want to have some best practices from Microsoft. You can also import that specific workbook and it will dig into your landing zones and will give you advice. If you, for example, look at the one describing the anti-malware, if you open the workbook, for example, let me scroll it, it will look into everything related to anti-malware assessment. It will specify the ones that the servers that have Windows Defender deployed, the ones that have Defender, and even digs into the ones that don't have anything, and so on and so on. So it's a simple way to visualize any data analysis without you going into running into any KQL queries or using that QSO query language. If you're not familiar with that one, I would definitely pinpoint out that you look into all those workbooks available in your Azure environment. Just remember, as an important aspect when you want to use Azure Workbooks or any other monitor feature, is that you enable the diagnostic settings to send Azure platform metrics and logs to your log analytics workspace. To configure these for a resource like a Key Vault is quite easy. Go to the diagnostic settings. If you don't have a setting, just click on Add Diagnostic Settings. If you want to do it through the portal, select all those different categories, select the metrics, specify Send to your log analytics workspace, and you're good to go. And all information will be put in there. And if you have some workbooks in place or you want to run some KQL queries, you can, all the information will be there and all the data can be analyzed. You need to do it for quite a lot of resources in your environment. If you want to look into which one are not configured with diagnostic settings, just type in diagnostic settings in the global search bar, select all your subscriptions, and click on load more, and you can see on which resources in your environment you can set those diagnostic settings. You can see I have quite a lot where they don't have configured. You can also run specific queries or specific Azure PowerShell scripts that dig this out. But if you want to quickly look at in a visual way, just go to those diagnostic settings and pinpoint out those that don't have any diagnostic settings configured at this moment. Let me go back to my slides. Tip 6, where we focus on some helpful tips and recommendations. Sorry, let me drink for a short. For utilizing two free-to-use built-in Azure services, Azure Advisor and Azure Service Health. Azure Advisor, and probably a lot of people will know it, is your free-to-use personalized cloud consultant that helps you follow best practices to optimize your Azure deployments. For this, it analyzes your resource configuration and uses telemetry, and then recommends solutions that can help you improve the cost effectiveness, performance, reliability, and even security of your Azure resources. But to use it, most of the time you need to open the Azure portal to look into all those recommendations. But luckily, there are some easier ways to use them without you needing to open the Azure portal. So once again, global search bar, type in Advisor, scroll down, and underneath monitoring, you see something like alerts. You can see I already configured quite some alerts in my environment. You can just click on New Advisor Alert, go through them. Just select all categories, also select all levels, select the scope, which is always a subscription. So if you have 20 subscriptions, you will need to create 20 alerts. Specify an action group. In an action group, an Azure Monitor action group, you just specify specific shared mailbox you want to send everything to, or different mailboxes, or maybe you want to put it in your ITSM service that it ends up over there and that people can look into it. Just specify an Azure Action Monitor group, what you want to do. In my case, I mostly send it through a shared mailbox. Specify that one, and whenever a new advisor recommendation is enabled, it will be sent through email to that specific action group. Also, for example, you have something like recommendation digits, same thing, but this will gather all information of a specific time window. So maybe every month you want to send a recommendation digit, just specify all the new recommendations will be gathered together, and at the end of the month, same thing, they will send through email. So once again, you don't need to open the Azure portal anymore to look into any of those recommendations. Simply gather it. Maybe a CCO wants to have those. Just create an action group, specify those CISOs in shared mailbox or specify their email addresses sorry, separately and send it through. Same thing, you also have another free service you can use, Service Health. Same thing, instead of looking into all those specific ones, just create a Service Health alert. Once again, same thing, create a Service Health alert which gathers for your specific regions, for all services, and will send all that information through an action group. Azure Service Health Alerts, Advisor Alerts, keep in mind, just configure it, doesn't cost you any money, and you don't need to open the portal again. Let me share my slides again. So we talked through this. We're all familiar with service level agreements. There are contracts between you and your cloud service provider that ensure a certain level of service availability for the service you have subscribed to. Sorry. For your Azure services, you can, for example, look at the web page describing the service level agreement. There's a lab page, but there's also an easier way. Once again, if you go to Azure Advisor, just open it. Remember those workbooks we talked about? You also have workbooks for specific services into your environment, like the ones through Azure Advisor. And you have a reliability one and a service retirement one. So if you look at the reliability one, look at the compute, look at this, you will get all the SLAs for all the VMs you're running inside your environment. You will see don't availability zone applies, availability sets applied, and so on and so on. Backup isn't configured. So everything related to SLA, simply by using this specific workbook, I don't need to look at that service level agreement anymore. It just pinpointed for all the resources in my environment, and I can easily look at all those different SLAs. So let me go back. So we talked about this one. A common vulnerability and exposure, CVE, for people who don't know it, is a publicly known and documented security vulnerability or weakness found in software, hardware, or other technology projects. Each of those CVEs is assigned a unique identifier, and for Microsoft resources, you can find those CVEs on the MCR's webpage. But once again, instead of going through this webpage or subscribing to the RSS feed, to also be informed about when they are found for any of your Azure resources, there is an easy way these days. Just go to Azure Service Health in your environment, select Security Advisories, and if any CVE is found for any of your Azure resources, it will be shown there. Once again, if you configure that alert, you will get it through email, for example, and you even don't look at the Azure portal anymore. Next thing, ensuring the security for all your identities is a vital aspect of safeguarding your Azure environment. So let us now quickly focus on some tips and recommendations that can assist you with this. So first and foremost, global administrators are accounts that hold the keys to your Azure kingdom. And as a best practice, the advice is that you should only assign the global admin role to users who generally need to manage features and data across all your Microsoft Online services. But next to that, it's really advisable to limit the number of global admin accounts to a maximum of 2 or 5 accounts within your organization. Next to that, probably and hopefully everybody is already using MFA, but it's quite an essential thing to use for enhancing the security of your identities. However, what do you do when MFA malfunctions and you find yourself unable to access services like the Azure portal? This can lead you to being locked out of your Azure AD organization and unable to sign in with any of your administrative accounts anymore. And to address this issue, you can create 2 or maximum 3 emergency access accounts, also known as break glass accounts. Just remember to use those accounts only when critical emergencies apply and when they're absolutely necessary to use. When creating this account, you should consider a few configuration settings. Keep in mind, it should have the global admin role. So remember the previous slide, 2, 3, 2 to 5, 2 of them already MFA, only 3 accounts left that you can give that global admin role. And next to that, best practice is to use a cloud-only account using the onmicrosoft.com domain. Those accounts shouldn't be federated or synchronized with any on-premises environment, and you should assign the global administrator role to this account, like I already said. Also use quite a long and complex password for it, consisting of at least 265 characters. You can split it into 17 separate vaults and so on. But lastly, and quite important, monitoring these accounts is quite crucial. For this, you can use tools like MCAS or Azure AD Audit. Do it especially monitoring for any signs-ins to keep track of the account activity and detect any potential security issues. Also, if you have a Microsoft Enterprise P1 or P2 license, it's highly recommended to utilize the new name, Microsoft Entra ID Protection. This service employs advanced machine learning to detect sign-in risks and unusual user behavior and enabling actions like blocking, limiting, or granting access as needed. And furthermore, it will also provide deeper insights into your identity security posture. So if you have those specific licenses, definitely also use this. In relation to identities, we also have Azure Role-Based Access Control. I need to quickly look at my time, or RBAC. So let's quickly delve in some tips and recommendations for Azure RBAC as well. So when you have Azure RBAC, it's crucial to always use the principle of least privilege. You have the option to use a single building role, such as the Azure Backup Contributor role, or create your own custom roles. But additionally, you can also combine different roles for specific scenarios. For instance, as displayed on the screen right now, you can use a combination of roles to grant an Azure administrator the least privileged access required, for example, for working with Azure Bastion, where you can see I combined the reader role on that specific resource group with the virtual machine user login pinpointed at the complete subscription. So keep in mind, RBAC roles, you can combine, here's your custom roles, but you also can combine roles on different levels. Next to that, and quite important as a best practice, when adding those role assignments, it's, in my opinion, also recommended to apply them to security groups rather than on the individual users. This approach makes it easier to maintain control over all the role assignments. You just add a specific user to a specific resource group, and everything, all RBAC roles applied on that specific resource group will also apply to that user. That user no longer requires those specific roles, just delete it out of the group and you're good to go. At the end of the month, we all know somebody still needs to pay the Azure bill. That's why it's crucial to closely monitor your Azure cloud spending so you don't be surprised when you receive and look at your Azure bill at the end of the month. Luckily, this is where Azure Cost Management can help you. It's a set of tools and services that can help you in managing and optimizing your cloud costs. One such example is the Cost Analysis feature, which provides you with valuable insights into your Azure cloud spending patterns. And the information gathered through these analyses can play a crucial role in effectively controlling and optimizing your Azure expenses. But another helpful tool, in my opinion, related to cost management is Azure Budgets, which allows you to set financial limits and receive alerts if users or resources exceed those budgets. However, it's quite essential to remember that budgets, some people seem to forget it, solely being used as notifications. So the tool's primary function is to send an alert, and it still remains the recipient's responsibility, typically an Azure administrator, to take appropriate action to execute the necessary actions. You can, for example, where he sets up an Azure monitoring runbook to fix that specific resource or drop that specific resource. Quite easy to set up. Go to Azure Cost Management, specify an amount. Once again, specify an action group. Same thing as with creating those Azure Advisor alerts, Service Health alerts. Specify it, and whenever it's set up and that threshold is that pricing threshold is overseeded, it will end up with an alert in those. You can open it in the cost alerts, but you will also receive anything you specified in that Azure Monitor action group. For example, an email. So that specific person will get an email that a specific budget, for example, 80% of that 200 euros is spent. It will all already be informed that he's reaching that budget limit. So definitely cost alerts, also any cost management and billing alerts will pop up over there. Last tip, before we close off, focusing on Azure landing zones, I will quickly go to it, and we're finally there. So first of all, it's important to know what an Azure landing zone is. An Azure landing zone serves as a well-architected and standardized foundation for deploying cloud resources in Microsoft Azure. It's a predefined and reusable framework that establishes the initial structure, governance, and security controls for your Azure environment, ensuring also a consistent and compliant deployments. Through subscriptions, an Azure landing zone effectively isolates application resources and even platform resources. And on the screen, for example, you can see the enterprise scale architect, once again, which is a component of the CAP framework, on which shows all different enterprise scale landing zones. For a lot of people and companies, this might rather appear quite complex, but fortunately, there are also some reference implementations available to assist you in getting started. Just go to this specific GitHub page, and you have different descriptions describing which type of enterprise scale architecture is being deployed in your environment. You just click on deploy to Azure, go to all those specific parameters, and you already can start following those best practices related to any landing zones described in any of these. Simply go to this GitHub, see that you have some subscriptions in place, and just push it out and see how it looks. It will deploy everything. It will take quite a lot of time. You can see, for example, it deploys those management groups. It sets specific policies in initiatives, and so on and so on, and it will deploy resources. Next to that, you can also use quite a lot of different landing zone accelerators. Once again, it's quite easy to look them up. Just go to Bing, type in Azure Landing Zone Accelerator, and you already will find some for Azure App Services, AKS, Azure API Management, Azure Arc Enabled Service. So if you want to set up specific landing zones, focusing on those specific workloads, just look it up. If you're lucky, there are already some accelerators in place that you can use to deploy those specific landing zones. I already mentioned this one. This one is also related to landing zones. It's the Azure Reviews checklist. It's once again a GitHub page. It's a workbook you can use, which describes best practice checklists for any of your Azure landing zones, and they're delivered by the Fast Track team for Azure, which added all those best practices in those landing zones and best practices in that workbook. So just deploy it, pinpoint it to a specific landing zone, and see if you can adjust something or improve something. And with that being said, I think it's time for Q&A, if we still have some time. I hope we still have some few minutes. I don't know if there are any questions at the moment.
Thank you, Wim, for a great presentation. So we'll get into the questions and answers part now. So should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the questions window and we will get to it at the end. So just a couple of questions in here. Someone is asking, how do you mostly deploy your management group structure?
So, like I already showed on the screen before, I have that specific management group hierarchy. I never apply anything on the tenant root group. I also let that tenant group follow that naming convention of those other management groups. So I first specify that one. I always use that specific ID. I have this place name. I create a specific GUID, and then I mostly place specific policy initiatives on those management group levels. So everything that's more general, I place on a top level management group. If it's more specifically maybe related to my art management group or to my AVD, like I said, I pinpoint specific initiatives, only focusing on those resources on those management groups. And that's how I mostly do it.
Brilliant, thanks a million. So just another question then, someone is asking, how do you mostly split up your Azure policy assignments? At which level do you apply what?
Yeah, just like I said, that's the same thing. So the more general ones on that top level management group, that company top management group, and more specific ones, I also split them up. You have that platform landing zone, and that landing zone with all those different landing zones underneath. So my platform, I purely dedicate everything to those gateways, identity, and all that stuff in a initiative focusing on that platform. And then all the other ones are mostly pinpoint initiatives at those different management groups underneath that landing zone management group. That's how I mostly do it. But it can be a mix, a hybrid one also. Some companies have don't use an initiative for those specific landing management groups underneath that landing zone and pinpoint just 10 single definitions. Also, it also works, but I like to combine, so I try to use initiatives.
Brilliant, thanks a million, Wim. So just one more question then, and someone wants to know, is it easy to import a community workbook?
It's quite easy. It's mostly written just in JSON. So most of the time, if you go to workbooks, you also can look at that community hub. Click on there. It will pinpoint you probably to a GitHub page. You can also look at workbooks GitHub. There's an Azure monitoring group GitHub page, and in there's also a specific part focusing on those workbooks. Most of the time, it's just a JSON. You just need to import it, and that's it. And then you can start using that workbook. And the most important thing, it's completely for free, and it's already built. So you don't need to look at all that, where you need to pick up that specific query, where you need to get that specific data. It's just there, visual way to easily look into anything monitoring related, or you want to pinpoint something out. So definitely look into those, because despite that, a lot of companies don't use it, and they're still running KQL queries. And then mostly I show, yeah, you have that workbook for that, and you have that workbook for that, and then that's quite easy to use. Yeah, just look at it. Quite easy to use. JSON, import it, done.
Brilliant, thanks a million, Wim. And that seems to conclude our questions. So just on behalf of the ESPC community, I want to extend a big thank you to you again for taking the time to carry out this webinar. We really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Hopefully people learn something about it. Hopefully one tip will help them somewhere.
Brilliant. So that is the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. That is it for today, folks. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope that you'll join us again for more learning. Bye for now.
Bye.